me. You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
We are the Mad Men of Masculinity.
Your home for healthy masculinity. We're just real men having real conversations for you. Hey, we are live.
Hey, I am Kirk M. Samuels.
And I am Jason B. Kendrick.
And we are the Mad Men of Masculinity.
That's right. We're just real men having real conversations.
For who?
For you.
Y'all know what time it is.
You know what time it is.
Conversation for you. We be having conversations. This one's for you.
Yeah, this is for you because we be talking to each other.
We can't have on the radio.
Well, that's true. That's true.
FCC don't like that.
They don't like that. This be one of those ones we're gonna be walking the line.
Oh yeah.
Have you been watching the news lately?
Dude, I tell you what, man. So
yeah, what? You've been watching
man,
news?
I've been watching the news, and if you've at all been anywhere near the news, you've probably heard of my hometown, man.
I mean, DC's been doing some craziness.
Not only did my football team kind of have a little not so good week. Then right after that, man, I was traveling. I get back and I hear about this thing that happened.
What happened
in the DC area, man? I've flown in and out of there. I don't know how many times, man. And DCA, i.e. Ronald Reagan National Airport, is probably one of the hairiest airports in the area to get out of, man. Yep. BWI is out on the Maryland side. Dulles is further out on the Virginia side, and nobody really likes Dulles because it's weird and it's out there. But I'd like to fly into the BWI side because that's where that's where moms live and all that kind of stuff. But man, so we had this mid-air crash, this mid-air incident.
Incident. That's a good word for it. Incident.
Over and into the Potomac River, man. And and I saw this. I mean, not only did it hit home because it literally hit home for me. But man, I thought about there's so many ins and outs of this whole thing, and I'm thinking, who do I know?
You know somebody?
Who do we know?
Do we know somebody?
See, sometimes it's not what you know.
It's who you know.
Sometimes it's who you know.
Yeah, who do you know?
We got a guy.
Who's the guy?
We got a guy, man. I mean, I can't think of, there's not many more qualified people to kind of get into some of the ins and outs of this whole topic of this whole thing. There's not many more qualified people than the one and only Mr. Mark Hardcastle. How you doing, sir?
Hey, thanks for having me on, guys.
My guy, man. I mean, you are my guy. I mean, you my guy. I mean,
go back.
I got like a few guys, and you are my guy, man. I mean, seriously.
We've been around the block a time.
We've been around the block.
Hey, who's this guy over here off my right side?
Man.
Well, see, I'm the other guy.
Yeah.
See, I'm not his guy right now. Yeah, you're the guy.
No, you're his guy.
You're the guy.
Multiple times a week. Every once in a while, he goes.
Well, see, once
pulls me out.
Once the checks start going in, then I'm not his guy anymore.
So, Mark, you're the guy.
You're the guy.
Seriously. This is going to be one of those, and if you're watching this, on YouTube or Facebook or anything like that, you're going to want to tune in to hear. So just for a minute or two, first of all, Mr. Mark Hardcastle, man, when's the first time you were in an airplane? In a pilot seat.
Okay, all right, yeah, so that's different.
Yeah.
First time in a pilot seat, I was
pilot or co-pilot.
Yeah, I was in college, and I had been selected to be in the Air Force pilot track. When I first went to college, I wasn't even going to be a pilot. That's a whole different story.
Mm-hmm.
But I got selected to be a pilot. So then the Air Force puts everyone through a screening program, and they put me in this little Cessna 172 and gave me 10 flights or something like that, and just to see if you got to have three things to be a pilot. You got to have a good head, good heart, good hands. And they wanted to make sure I had those three things before they sent me off to the real pilot training. And that was in 1981. That would be fall semester. No, spring semester of 1982.
Wow.
Yeah. You guys weren't even born yet.
Hey, man, I was around, dude. Tanner wasn't born. I don't know.
Tanner
was born. Where were you? Tanner wasn't born.
He wasn't even a glimmer in his daddy's eye.
He wasn't even born.
Yeah, that was the first time I put my hands on the yoke of an airplane to try to.
And so fast forward a little bit, hit the little 10-second thing on the Netflix. Fast forward a little bit. So ultimately, you became an Air Force pilot.
Right. So here's the CV. Here's the history. So graduated from college summer of '82. Went straight into Air Force pilot training. It was a year-long program, and they take about the top third of the class and send them either to fighters or to bring them back in to be instructors. So I fell into that category. Turned right around and spent the next 4 years being an instructor pilot, teaching people how to fly jets. Did that for 4 years. My follow-on assignment was into reconnaissance, strategic reconnaissance. I flew an airframe that was known as the RC-135. Many of your audience will have heard of KC-135, which is a tanker frame. We didn't do any tanker work. We were aerofuelable. We got to take advantage of the tankers, but it was the same basic airplane, but they filled the back with radio gear.
Did you have the disc on top?
We did not.
Okay.
That's a very common question, but we did not have the disc on top. So I did that for 4 years. Very cool situation. I finished out my last hurrah in the Air Force was the Persian Gulf War in 1991. Saw some crazy things in that airframe during that time. And left the Air Force in September of 1991, was 2 weeks unemployed, already had a job, and hired by the Air Force, by the airline in October of 1991, and been living the dream ever since.
Now, I do remember October 1991. That was the fall of my freshman year in college.
All right.
So a little back.
We're both starting our careers.
Now,
you're starting yours. I started mine.
Now, the reason he knew a little bit about that plane that you mentioned is because he too was in the Air Force.
Yeah, you'd be funny there, bold boy. But no, yeah, I actually entered in 3 years after you got out, so I was into '94. But in October '91, I was in Nuremberg, Germany. So as soon as Gulf War started, I remember all of a sudden we had MPs at the gate around the school checking our bags and IDs, and then I went in.
Wow.
One of my worst kind of like regrets was that I just assumed, without ever researching or asking anybody, I just assumed that my dumb self wasn't academy material. So I didn't apply to the academy.
That's a shame.
It wasn't until I was enlisted and I found out my dad's second wife, both her brothers, twin brothers, were in the academy. Her father was in the academy. He was a World War II pilot. And I had like a 3.86 or something, So
you had a lot of points on the application if you'd filled it out.
If I had actually even tried, I could have. And every time we go play over at Family Sports, we play golf, and I see all the planes coming into Centennial. I'm like, I should have been a pilot. Yeah. So I kind of hate you a little bit right now, but that's okay. It wasn't your fault. Your fault. It's a good way.
Hate in a good way.
It was a good way.
It's the best possible way.
Yeah. Because I envy the fact that you did that, because I could think about when I was a F-16 weapons troop. So I was loading guns, loading missiles and bombs. I was, underneath the jet more than anything else. The only time I got to sit in it usually was during checks, ECM checks, things like that, or brake rides, whatnot. But that was it.
Yeah.
And so, I would spend more time underneath the jet than in the jet. And so when I see pilots, I'm like, I hate you a little bit.
You were working.
Force as an instructor, and they made me an instructor in the training center, teaching people how to fly various airplanes. By the time they came to me, they, all these guys were airline pilots, so they've been around a block of time too. But every few years, many of us would transition to different airframes, and so I was teaching people how to fly the Boeing 757/767 airframe. They were coming from all kinds of different airframes. And so I trained them on that, did that for a few years, and then left the training center, went out and flew as just a regular line guy for a while, went back in the training center again, then went back out to fly big airplanes internationally. And I finally got to be a captain. Gosh, it's been almost 8 years ago now, and flew 7 years as a captain on Boeing 737s based domestically, and flew basically anywhere that my company flies out of Denver. 7 years, and then had my last hurrah on March 22nd, a year ago, coming up on the anniversary of my retirement. So I'm still relatively current. I still keep in touch with a number of guys that are still active, and got a little bit of a military background. So I speak military, and I speak airline, and so I'm Now, the crazy thing, 32 years with United Airlines, and I never once flew to an international airport.
Wow.
Not one time.
You're lucky.
That is, well, it's almost unimaginable. And it's just of the airline industry. I've flown into Dulles,
And obviously, you're not here to represent an airline. You're not here to represent, NTSB or
Right.
FAA, none of that kind of stuff. You're here because you've been flying so long that they made you get out.
well, that's true. And just to be clear on that, it's federal law that airline pilots they have to retire at age 65. That's the only reason I left. There are things about it I miss, there are things about it I don't miss. I would not have left at that point if they had not forced me out, just as a matter of law. But you're right. I am just a retired guy who knows a thing or two from 32 years in the commercial industry and almost a decade in the military before that. And that's really all I bring to the table today. I don't speak for United Airlines. I love the company. I certainly don't speak for the government. I don't speak for the Air Force. I'm happy to offer, any insights that I may have picked up, during my 4 decades.
Well, that's why we brought you in, because we, as the knuckleheads, usually on the show, we just talk out of our rear ends about whatever we think anyway. So sometimes it's good for us to bring an expert in to correct us occasionally and just be like, oh, maybe you're on base, you're off base, you're way out in left field. That's kind of why we brought you in, because we need somebody sometimes to correct us and
Cool. Let me just turn off the microphone. I'll just kind of sit back here.
There
You
you
guys talk, and every once in a while I'll come in. Hey, put my mic back on. I got to say something.
I think even in any setting, you would clearly be considered a subject matter expert on being able to talk aviation and what happens in flying, in the Air Force. I mean, not in the Air Force, just in aviation in general. I mean, I think you would be qualified. I mean, you got the gray hair and everything, man. I mean, you are the quintessential.
The gray beard.
You're the guy.
I look more like a seafaring captain than an airline captain at this point.
No, you got the Sully S thing going on now. You're
one of the highest compliments I was ever paid. There were several times where I'd stand at the door of the cockpit with my uniform on, my hat on, and people say, "Hey, you look like you." No, 2 people. And one was Sully. Several times people said I look like Sully. The other person was, believe it or not, now if you took these whiskers off, it'd look a little bit more realistic. But I got compared to Joe Biden a couple of times.
Oh, ouch! Sorry about that.
Yeah. But man, you are definitely, and we're going to get into later like what you're doing now. I mean, man, you're an author, you're a dynamic speaker, all these other kind of things, man. You're a quintessential Renaissance man, and so we're going to get into some of that later. But we come back from this break. We're going to kind of get into some of the banter about like what's going on. A lot of people don't know what goes on in a flight, just going from A to Z, and so we're going to get into that, and we'll get into kind of the ins and outs of a little bit of what we know about what happened with the incident over at DCA since then. So we'll be right back right after this. Men of Masculinity on KLDC.
Boom. Now you can take a drink. Scratch scenes. So now y'all know, people. This is why we bring these guys in, because you love listening to us, but we need to bring some experts in occasionally, because either tell us to shut up or you got it right, or you're off base. That's why we bring these folks in.
Absolutely.
I'll do my best. I don't, Kirk, you're very kind to call me an expert, subject matter expert.
You definitely have the experience.
I don't call myself an expert in pretty much anything. But
you're just
that's a wise man right there.
I do something for 30 years. I'm gonna be an expert on it.
Well,
but that's just me.
But everything changes.
But you're a more classy guy than I am. So that just speaks for itself.
I don't.
See, the wisest man in the room tells us he doesn't know everything. Exactly. See what happens? So now we know who that is.
They say rich is loud, but wealth whispers.
Oh, I like that.
That's nice. Look at that. Look at this guy.
All right, here we go.
You're reading fortune cookies again.
We're back.
Yes, we're back.
Mad Men of Masculinity.
Right here on KLDC.
We are doing this thing here today, man. MadmenRadio.com.
Yes.
All the above. We're having a conversation today about largely around not only what goes behind the scenes of us taking flights, and so many of us do. I'll be on a plane in 24 hours from now. Matter of fact, going back to So anyhow, We're going to get into some of the ins and outs, and maybe even some of the details of the crash. We got Captain Mark Hardcastle, his call sign Hardcore. Not many people know that. I do. I know these things, man. I have 2 regrets in life. One is not seeing Prince in concert, and 2 is not being on a plane piloted by Captain Mark Hardcastle.
How fun would that
I
have been?
promise you, man, I would have loved that.
Oh,
Man.
you would have thrown him off your plane. You would
I
have made it
would've-
so much
Oh, no,
ruckus.
I would have loved that, man.
No.
Because you would tell me about the talk you would do before the flight, and you would kind of bring the crew and the passengers together, man. I've always wanted to fly. It is what it is. So Mark, when a pilot gets to the airport, right? I don't know if you call it a shift or a flight or whatever. When it's his first day out, he's leaving. He arrives at the airport. What does he do? Like what is his beginning of his day look like to get to the airplane?
When you're flying in the major airlines, I call it it's comparable to the show. Major League Baseball. We've graduated from the farm club. We're at the top of the industry. And what that means is I, as the captain of the airplane, have an awful lot of support. So I show up, and when I get to the operations office, there's already a flight plan waiting for me. The dispatcher has already looked at the weather. He's looked at the passenger load, the cargo load. He's decided how much fuel is appropriate. He's planned out the route of flight. And all I have to do is download all of that stuff to my iPad, and it shows up in living color. And I've got a magenta line across the screen of the iPad, and I can bring up just like watching the weather on TV. You get the radar and that kind of stuff. I can overlay all that stuff. So I look at that. I read the flight plan, read the notes, look at the maintenance of my airplane, the maintenance status of my airplane. I decide if I have enough fuel. Frequently would have a brief conversation with the dispatcher. He's sitting in Chicago. I pick up my cell phone, give him a quick call to clarify anything on it. Then I head for the jet. And I go down to the jet. Tried to be down there 1 hour prior to departure. And I had a little routine that I would go through. The first thing I would do is have a brief conversation with the gate agent, who usually showed up at the gate about an hour prior to push. And we talk about the boarding process. We talk about airport security, make sure we're all on the same page, what time, if there were any delays that we knew about, whether we wanted to board on time, whether we wanted to delay boarding, those kinds of things. And then I'd move down the jet bridge, and my flight attendants would show up at the jet. Let's say supposed to board 40 minutes prior. They'd show up between 45 and 50 minutes prior. And I'd have an in-depth briefing with my flight attendants, make sure they were all in a good place, mentally healthy, happy, glad to be there, well-fed, all those kinds of things. And I'd advise them of the status of all the things that I just looked at. And we'd have a conversation. We talk about how we were going to all work together to give the passengers a great experience. And from there, at about 5 minutes before boarding time, I'd go back up to the boarding area, and I would actually pick up the microphone and say hello to my passengers before they were boarded. And I'd tell them what was going on, and if there were going to be any delays, if the plane was broken, if the airplane was going to be late arriving, what all that would mean to them. But on about 90% of the time, there was nothing going on. So I would just take that moment to welcome my passengers and let them know how much I appreciated them being there. And Kirk, you know this, and Jason, I don't know how much you fly, but you probably fly a bit.
Not as much as I like.
Getting to the gate's not easy. So they will have been through their challenges. And I just want to acknowledge that and let them know how much I appreciate them jumping through all those hoops and ensure that we're going to have a great flight and welcome. I'm glad to be here, and we'll see you down the jet bridge. And
that's why I always wanted to be on a Captain Mark Hardcastle flight, man. I mean that's gold. That's just gold standard. Right?
Yeah, that's a golden ticket flight right there. Like you get the pilot greeting you before you even get on the plane, and he's actually acting like your people. Like, hey, welcome, people. Some of the pilots are just kind of like, hey, get in the back.
That's great.
Get your that was the thing. I wanted to empathize with my passengers as humans and try to elevate the experience for them a little bit. And that's just a matter of style. And then from there, I get down in the cockpit, start throwing switches just like every other pilot. And then we fly the jet.
So everybody's loaded. Who are you talking to as a pilot? Like when you're, before
controllers in the FAA tower. And then we go through a sequence talking to the ground controllers. We taxi out to the runway. Then we're handed off to the tower controller. The tower controller clears us for takeoff. We get airborne, and they hand us off to the radar controllers, and we're off and running.
That's awesome. See, most folks have no idea.
We have no idea.
They just show up, and they're like, "Oh, the pilot just got in there,
Yeah.
and he just like."
And we're sitting back there.
No idea.
We're sitting back there. We have 6 exits. We have 2 in front, 4 over the wing.
Yeah.
And 2, we're back again, and we don't know all that stuff's going on up in the cockpit, man. Just to get up in the air.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Yeah, I think back about when I was working on jets in the Air Force and just all the things we did prior to the pilot showing up, and then pilot comes in, checks the aircraft, checks the security armaments, checks the pods or whatever he's got, checks fuel status, all those different things, and then he hops in and gone, and we're just like, all right, welcome.
Yeah, and he has been talking on the radio from the time before he starts his engine.
Yeah,
talks to people all the way out.
So you have a flight plan, and the flight plan is programmed into the airplane, right?
That's right.
And then, what percentage of the time is the airplane on autopilot? What we call autopilot?
Yeah, and that's the right thing to call it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a high percentage of the time because we spend a lot of time flying, and particularly on international flights. I mean, my longest flight was about 15 hours back, and we would not want to be up there trying to maintain altitude. Hand flying, we call it. So typically, it's a matter of pilot preference and style. But my preference was I would fly it from brake release on the runway. I would fly manually take off, and then all the way up to cruise altitude. Many guys would fly it up to about 18,000 feet. There's a transition that happens at 18,000 feet. And so some guys would use that as a time to put the autopilot on and let the autopilot fly it up to altitude. But I'd get to altitude. There were some things I'd check around, make sure everything was operating properly, and I'd put the autopilot on, and then we would cruise for however long it took till we got top of descent, we would call it, which is generally about a half an hour before our scheduled arrival time. And works out about that way. And about a half an hour prior to arrival time, we are able to, at that point, usually close the throttles. We do an idle descent all the way down. And then on the autopilot. And then at some point, and as we approach the terminal, we would turn the autopilot off in most circumstances and manually fly the airplane to landing.
How long does it take you to get smooth at watching all, the altitude, altimeter, your compass, your directions, indicators, all those things? And my father was a private pilot, and I remember being 12 maybe, and we were up in the plane, and he's like, "Here, hold the yoke. You want to keep it on, this heading at this altitude." And so I'm, as a kid, going back and forth, and I'm just rocking my baby sister to sleep because that plane, I'm just like, "Oh, this," and I'm making all these little adjustments as that plane is just rocking back and forth, and I'm like, I know that having had that minute experience, it's not the easiest thing in the world. How long does it take you to get good?
It's a learned skill, just like in any other. I mean, how long does it take you to get good at leaving a very clean weld? Trying to put 2 pieces of metal together. Any of a number of things. How long does it take you to get smooth at playing jazz on a keyboard? And as far as what you're talking about is what we call a cross check. And we had one main instrument. We called it an attitude instrument, and had nothing to do with my state of mind. But it's the physical attitude of the airplane. Are the wings level? Is the nose too high? Right. What's going on that way? So we're always conscious of what is the steady state attitude of the airplane, and we have an indicator in case we're in the clouds. If we're it is what we call an artificial horizon. It has an artificial horizon because when there are no clouds, we use the horizon, the actual horizon of the Earth, as our main attitude indicator as we're trying to figure out the airplane. Horizon are the other performance instruments. And then the radio navigation aids that tell us whether we're on course or not, those are all right around that attitude indicator. So we spend the majority of our time looking at the attitude indicator and making corrections to the attitude of the airplane, and then we take a quick glance over to the altimeter, quick glance over to the airspeed, quick glance over to the vertical speed, those kinds of things. And you learn that early on as you're becoming a pilot. And it comes a time where you can, in modern airplanes, the instruments are laid out in such a way that you can sort of back out and see them all at once.
Nice.
And it all integrates, and that's, it takes a while to do that, but realistically, I had that idea in mind. I wasn't real good at it by the time I finished Air Force pilot training, but certainly by the time I became an instructor.
I was going to say, you went from training to being an instructor, so you obviously were pretty good.
So I was able to see the big picture,
Gotcha.
is the way I put it, pretty easily, and then at that point, flying the airplane becomes almost secondary to accomplishing the mission with the airframe.
Right.
And that's still true even in the airlines. We fly the airplane from point A to point B, but the mission involves a whole lot more than that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, and that was one of the questions we'll probably get into in the next segment, but I know there seems to be, especially with the commercial airlines, there's a lot more structure because you have so many planes and you have to stay in your lane and everything else, versus you see a lot of the Air Force pilots, especially fighter pilots, where they're going from A to B, but how they get there sometimes is questionable.
Okay.
Well, that's just what I've, they say, hey, we're going here and there. Then all of a sudden you see, of course, a lot of this I'm sure is Hollywoodized in the movies, where they're like, oh, well, I'm just going to go over here. I want to take this valley through the mountains here, or I want to go this way or that way. And then it's like, instead of having to be like at this altitude on this heading the whole time.
So just to address that very briefly, those Top Gun, low level routes, that kind of thing, are all published routes that are very closely described. And it's similar. Those guys have on their screen, they have like I said, I have a magenta line on my laptop. Well, that also, on my iPad, rather, that also goes on to right below my attitude indicator is my navigation display. And I have a magenta line on there. And the fighter pilots on those low level routes have the same kind of thing. And so those are all charted out on maps, and all of that's very closely planned and placed. There's nothing random about it.
So they're not just going off script. They're like, they have to actually get that approved. And
there are highways in the sky.
Yeah.
There are, like some of them are at 35,000 feet, and some are at 500 feet.
Gotcha.
And those routes are all published. And so, like for instance, when Maverick wants to go down and fly his Top Gun route to go do the pop up and all that kind of stuff, he has to check see if anybody else is scheduling that route.
Right.
So,
and this is important when we get back to start talking about some of the details of the incident that happened out there. Back when, and this is leading into a question for the future too. When you get in the airplane, you're talking about the switches and knobs, all that stuff that you do.
What does that one do up there?
How does an airplane know its height off the ground, its altitude?
Yeah, so we can get way out in the weeds if you want to on that. But fundamentally, we have pressure sensors, and we have two kinds of pressure sensors. One of them is pointed right out the front of the airplane, and it senses how much air is flowing into that tube, and by how hard the air molecules are hitting the sensor inside, it knows how fast our forward direction is. And similarly, on the side of the airplane, we have sensors that test for what we call static pressure, and that is they are feeling the air molecules that the atmosphere is pushing in from the side. And so we have all kinds of computers that take those pieces of data and analyze them, and they can tell how high I am, how fast I'm going, all of that kind of dynamic stuff, and how fast those things are changing, how fast my airspeed is changing, how fast my altitude is changing. And it's basically those two sensors. Now that's fundamentally how an airplane works.
So, but let me cut to the chase before we go to this. Does a pilot have to dial in the barometric pressure?
Yes.
At the moment of the flight?
Yes.
Gotcha. And that feeds into everything else.
Feeds into all the computers.
Gotcha. We're gonna, man. I'm telling you, we're about to get juicy right here, man. Because now we're getting all of that with some lead-in kind of stuff, and now we're gonna get into
what happened.
How could this have happened, and maybe some of the factors involved.
Yep.
So we'll be right back. Men of Masculinity on KLDC.
We want to apologize to all y'all watching. I don't know what's going on the internet today, but it is in and out.
Yeah,
I saw that.
I locked up a couple times,
and I tried changing to another one, and that wasn't working at all. So sorry about that. We'll put the good recording from Tanner out on the podcast platforms. So,
but we
Yeah,
about this
the
is the
good
juicy stuff coming up right
Yeah.
here. So
Yeah.
hopefully
So
it'll-
before we get off the
Yeah.
how the airplane works thing,
Yeah.
that's something that's important.
Mhm.
Is and we might want to once we go back on
Yeah.
the air and just touch on this. All that stuff I talked about was how airplanes have worked for decades.
Mhm.
Modern airplanes use GPS for almost everything.
oh wow,
Mm.
We still take inputs from radio aids on the ground. We
Mhm.
still take inputs from all the air pressure, but most of our position in the air in 3 dimensions comes from GPS.
Mm.
And all the computers take all of that into account, but that allows us to be very, very precise within feet.
Mm.
yeah. I mean, that's something people want to know, especially when you live in a place like Denver that's a mile higher than sea level, and they're like, "Well, how does the plane know that it's this altitude off the ground when
And
When
when
it's
we,
talking to 3 or 4 satellites at once all the time, it can
Right.
triangulate very, very close.
Nice.
and obviously that is a huge factor when we talk about 2 aircraft that are supposed to be at certain altitudes,
Right.
and one of them obviously maybe wasn't at
Right.
what was expected.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
all the speculation going on and all the different it's almost comedy because I mean you're talking all kinds of theories all over the place about what had happened.
all right, let's get into the juice, and then
Let's do the
we'll,
juice.
Then the last segment we'll wrap
Make
it
you
up.
some money.
Sure.
Here we go.
And we're back.
Yeah.
Mad Men of Masculinity.
Mhm.
KLDC.
Mhm.
12:20 a.m.
This is the
in
one right
Power
here.
City.
This is the one right here.
You
man.
waited, folks. You waited for
Yeah.
the highlight reel. You
Yeah.
watched the previews. Now you're getting into the meat.
So here's the
Meat
juice.
potatoes.
And again, I went to public school, right? And and so what I've been able to gather is we had a regional jet coming from, I think it was Kansas City into DCA. Was it Kansas, right?
It's come from somewhere.
Crazy.
Somewhere.
Coming into DCA National Airport, and generally speaking, it was coming from south to north up the Potomac. And at the same time, we had a military aircraft, a H-60,
Black Hawk.
Black Hawk Army helicopter going from north to south. And unfortunately, unfortunately, they met at the same point in space in time. And that's a recipe for us losing 67 souls, 67 individuals, some service members on top of just some great Americans, some great people, and that's the unfortunate thing. And so we gotta, when we get into, like, Mark, how in the world, if all of this happened before flights and all these other kind of things, how in the world could some of the factors that go into these 2 aircraft meeting at the same place at the same time in space?
Yeah,
But now it's nighttime, and there's a lot of different factors, and
Well, I mean, you got 3, like you talking about. You got 3 satellites on every aircraft. That each aircraft is checking their location, and then you got collision avoidance systems, and you got all the CTEC and all the different ATCs there. It's like how it's like it just seems like it's.
I mean,
there's
obviously,
so
it was
many
human
checks.
error.
Yeah, it has to
mean,
be so many checks and balances. It's like, how could this happen?
Yeah, well, we think it's human error at this point.
Yeah.
But the first thing I want to make perfectly clear is note the amount of just how deeply everyone is confounded.
Mm-hmm.
The aviation system is so incredibly safe. We just scratch our heads. How is this even possible? It's been a long, long time since we had a mid-air collision. We've had a few ground collisions. We've had various other incidents or accidents, as you've noted. But it's mind-blowing that with all of the safety guardrails in the system, that this collision happened. Now, okay, so let's start to unpack it a little bit. What do we know at this point? What we know is, Kirk, you mentioned we got the RJ, regional jet, small jet, if you will, coming up the Potomac. He's lined up on a north-south runway, and it's almost exactly oriented north-south. Well, that's the main runway of the airport, and all airplanes that go in there can land on that runway. But they have 2 other crossing runways. Now, if you imagine an X, for today's purposes, we only need 1 additional runway that's oriented to the northwest, southeast. So we've got this X on the ground, and everybody can land on the north runway. Everybody can take off on the north runway, but smaller jets can land on the northwest, southeast runway. So it's not unusual. And again, I've never flown in there, but I've heard enough about this. And I've flown in similar airports like LaGuardia has similar problems. I mean, they got 3 airports they're dealing with, right? Well, as does Washington. But so it's not uncommon for either the pilot of the regional jet or the tower controller to ask the RJ to come off the north-south runway around to line up with the northwest-southeast runway. So now what that means is he's coming up here. He has to jink off to the right and then lean in to line up to land to the northwest. So that's one of the factors. Now, I don't know whether he was on autopilot at that point. I imagine he was probably on hand flying certainly from the time he had to make his jink to the right. I just cannot imagine him flying that with the autopilot. So he's hand flying. And then he goes somewhat belly up to make a left turn to line up on the northwest runway. And this is a factor that's unknown at this point as to what degree is he belly up. Well, if he's belly up to the north, I mean, his feet are pointing to the north. His feet are pointing at the helicopter. So the helicopter's coming south. And so there's one issue. And guys, 300 feet, the RJ pilot's 300 feet above the ground.
It's not very high.
He is 100%. I can't say 100%. That would not be true. He's very, very, very dialed in on course, on glide path after having just made this low altitude maneuver to line up on a different runway. Very, very focused. And doesn't mean he shouldn't be aware of other airplanes, but at some point,
you trust your ATC, right?
We tend to rely on air traffic control. Now, they can clear us to land, but you better believe as I get close to the runway, I'm looking at the runway myself to see if it's in fact clear. So there are things that pilots maintain responsibility for personal safety and safety of our passengers and all that. But to a high degree in a situation like that, the fixed wing pilot is relying on air traffic control and tower controller. So that's point number one. And he's got the pilot has crosshairs, and he's got all kinds of visual indications. He's on course, on glide path this way, course this way. And if they're X'd up in the middle of his attitude indicator, he's where he's supposed to be. And out on the runway, there are also visual lights that show on course, on glide path, those kind of. So he's got lots of information coming in that can keep him very precisely where he's supposed to be. The helicopter, on the other hand, I've never flown helicopters. I've certainly never flown the Black Hawk. I've never flown that Route 4. That is a published route, as we talked about before, with constraints, apparently, from what I understand. The maximum ceiling on that route is 200 feet.
Oh, wow.
And so, this is what we call procedural separation.
Right.
If the RGA is following the procedure on course, on glide path, worst case scenario, he's going to be at 300 feet. If the Black Hawk is within compliance of the procedures for Route 4 coming up the Potomac, highest he's going to be is 200 feet. So they're going to have at least 100 foot clearance. Now, that's not a lot of clearance in the air traffic control system.
Well, I mean, you only need 1 foot technically,
right,
to avoid, but I mean, 100 feet.
So the procedures that both pilots were following should have provided clearance. So, and what it looks like is now, as I understand it, we have recovered the black boxes from the RJ. Now, there are 2 black boxes that are critical. One is what we call a flight data recorder, and it's recording all those things that are on all the instruments and, from all the sources. It's sucking all that in, vacuuming it all up. So it knows exactly where the airplane was, and exactly what the status of the airplane was. And then there's a cockpit voice recorder, which also gives great information about what the pilots were thinking, what the pilots were seeing, what they're verbalizing. So that cockpit voice recorder takes in all the sound that's going on in the cockpit. So it hears everything both pilots are saying. It also can take in noises like when the pilot reaches for the landing gear handle, the landing gear goes down. He moves the flap lever. They can hear the flaps being sequenced through there.
Alarms.
So alarms, absolutely. So all of those things are on the data recorder and the voice recorder. And so it's critical to have those, and now we do. And those things are built such that they can survive crashes. apparently, the Black Hawk has similar data collectors. Apparently, it's a unified system. It's not two different things, but it's a data and voice recorder system in a single box. And from what I understand, they have those now too. So they will be analyzing those. And what I think is critical to find out, and there are a whole bunch of questions, but what were the Black Hawk pilots saying as they were approaching the flight path of the regional jet?
Right.
What we know is at some point, the Black Hawk was notified of regional jet traffic. Okay. So far, so good. What is not apparent, and again, I'm not the investigator. I don't have access to the tapes. But from what the press is telling us, and you know, you can hear some of the recordings online. I don't know if they've been doctored. I don't know how legit they are. But the information that seems to be coming to us is that the tower controller, who was doing the job of two people, neglected to point out the specific traffic he was talking about. Now, what he should have said was, hey, Black Hawk, Pat 25, I think was his call sign, Pat 25, you have RJ traffic at 1 o'clock, less than a mile,
300 feet.
At 300 feet, similar altitude. And you can, do you have that traffic in sight?
Yeah.
That's the kind of instruction that he should have been given. Now, what we're not hearing on the tapes that are online is that specific direction. I don't know what the pilots were told before the recordings that we're hearing. They might have said, hey, you got an RJ 3 mile turning to on a 3 mile left base, going to line up on runway 30, 33, whatever it was. Do you have that traffic in sight? We don't know. That would have been prior to the recordings that we had. What we also know is that another RJ had just taken off of the main runway, I think. It really doesn't matter, but it was the main runway or the northwest runway, had taken off and was now flying behind and to the right of the helicopter. And what I've heard on the recordings is the tower instructed the Black Hawk to pass behind the RJ. And if he's thinking, hey, that guy's over here, yeah, no problem. And I'm looking out over here. Yep, I see him.
Yeah.
And I can pass behind him real easy. Well, the traffic, the conflict is coming this way. And so
he's probably looking in the wrong direction at the wrong plane.
I've also heard speculation that there was another regional jet pilot behind the incident pilot, incident airplane. And there's speculation that the Black Hawk might have locked onto this guy rather than this guy that was in his face.
Well, you look at how much traffic at any, I mean, even if you come to Denver and you look at how much traffic going north and, east and west coming in, I mean, it's lined up. You can literally, people sit out there and just look and you just see them 5 or 10 in a row coming in.
And one of the factors at National, if you've ever flown in and out of National a lot, there's tons of just air traffic, tons of helicopter traffic, tons of military air. I mean, if you're coming up the Potomac, you have Joint Base Andrews kind of on the Maryland side. And then, it used to be Old Bowling Air Force Base kind of over the other side of Potomac. And obviously you got National right there. Well, a mile past National Airport, you got the Pentagon. I mean, it is not uncommon to be flying in and out of National to see other aircraft, especially helicopters, like right next to the airport. I mean, it is super, super congested. And I don't know. I've heard they had, maybe had night vision goggles. I don't know.
So let's talk about the scenario here.
Super quick. We're going into a break here.
Okay. So just real quick, here's some confounding factors. If we assume that they have night vision goggles, I have never used them, but I understand they give a restricted view.
It's like
tunnel vision, like blinders. So that is going to be a factor. Another factor that I'm not hearing enough chatter about is the fact that apparently there was a check ride going on, and the pilot who was actually operating the airplane was the one being evaluated. And here's a factor. The factor is that if there's an evaluation going on, frequently the evaluator has to allow a developing error to develop to a certain point before they intervene. So that's where the cockpit voice recorder on the Black Hawk is going to be absolutely critical.
Ooh, man, I'll tell you, man, this is obviously
so
we
much.
don't even have enough time. And we got one more segment. We don't have enough time to really unpack a lot of the if, thens, and could-haves.
Right.
But this is great stuff. We'll be right back. Mad Men of Masculinity on KLBC. Man, there's just tons
There's
of
so much. I mean, and it's funny because you see all of the theories about, oh, this was done on purpose. Then you got, I've seen the videos where they've actually had they've had the remote control Black Hawk, like they've actually tested and done that. So they're like, oh, they must have remote controlled, and and everybody's going, well, who's on the flight? What's the flight list?
Yeah, so it would probably be worth talking about very briefly, just to open the next segment. That look, we're not talking about any kind of conspiracy.
Yeah.
We're talking about a Black Hawk who got flown into the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah.
The question is why, and we don't even need a conspiracy to talk about that.
No, we don't need to go there, man. There's lives that are not here anymore. We get off into the weeds and all that kind of stuff, and it's just
And so what's undeniable is a mistake was made.
Absolutely.
A critical mistake was made.
Absolutely. Especially in like the DC area, like Kirk was talking about that. I mean, that
So
is a
congested.
highly congested and restricted and controlled area. And for this to happen there, I mean, I guess in some ways that makes more sense because of all of the traffic and the human error.
I mean, to immediately to the east of National Airport, you got the Monument, Capitol White House, all that kind of stuff. Immediately to the west of the airport, you got high-rise, buildings, office buildings, and it's just, man, it is so.
Which speaks to the other thing about the locking on to the wrong thing,
Right,
Because
exactly.
there is so much
Going
lighting
on,
yeah.
out there,
There is, and that
ground lighting, and I know how hard it is to pick out. Flying into Kansas City, for heaven's sake, if you're on downwind coming around a base turn to line up on the runway, and there's another airplane in front of you, it gets buried in the ground lights.
You can't even see it.
It's that is a confounding factor too.
Yeah.
Well, then I wouldn't even have time to bring it up, but even then you get into like ATC and all the stuff that they're dealing with, like that. What was that movie with Billy Bob Thornton and what was his name, John something or other? But like they're competing, air traffic controllers, and they're sliding their discs and they're sliding all the stuff, and they're trying to get this one here, and they're that high stress environment.
I haven't seen the movie you're talking about, but
it's an older movie, but
pushing 10 maybe.
It might have been pushing 10,
Yeah.
But it was something, and they were like competing ATC guys. But I mean, you put that in there with the a test ride, check ride, and then all the other flights. It's like, well, no wonder.
Is this our last segment?
Yeah, this is our last segment. So we're not going to spend the whole time. I want to make sure we get into.
We'll clear the conspiracy theory thing, and
Yeah.
we'll try and kind of put a bow on that, and then we want to talk about you.
Okay.
Yes, we're back.
Yep, we're back.
You made it to fourth quarter, y'all.
Fourth quarter, man.
I wish we had like 8
telling
quarters
you,
on this
man,
one.
there's
There's so much to talk
this
about.
thing. Which, by the way, you should go if you listen to us on the radio. You should go check out YouTube and Facebook and the videos that we have there, because we kind of in the breaks here. We just unpacking some other stuff that there's no way we even.
Yeah, check out Apple Podcasts and Spotify and all the places you can get podcasts. We'll put on the because yes, we did have some Wi-Fi issues, but that's okay because we have the good radio audio that I'll put on the podcast, so you guys will get everything. But yes, we want to clear up a few things. I know what a lot of people are saying now, especially on social media and all over the place, is all the conspiracy theories of the remote control Black Hawks and who's on the flight manifest and this and that. We want to clear a lot of that up.
Yeah, and this is not that. Like, it's not a political conversation on this and that, why, and all the political stuff and conspiracy theory and all that kind of stuff. There are lives lost, and we need to make sure that it doesn't happen again as best as we can. And unfortunately, a lot of times, and specifically even in the aviation industry, we learn from mistakes and we implement changes. And unfortunately, that's kind of the way things happen. So hopefully we can learn from this and as a system, maybe have another stretch of 15, 20, 30, 40 years without. I mean,
flying is still safer than driving.
Oh,
there's still far less issues. So, I mean, but of course, like with most things, when it comes to flying, when we do have issues, it's pretty big.
Yeah.
So that's why it gets so much attention. I mean, how many accidents do we have a day here in Denver? Like 20, 30 a day? I mean,
just trying to cross the street into
I'm
this
telling
building,
you, man,
kind of
almost get
cray-cray
run
around
over.
this bad boy. And so I think there's so many things to unpack. Again, when we talk about who should have said what. We just real quickly, we kind of left off a little bit with some of the conversation that maybe should have, and we don't fully have all the details yet, but some of the conversation that maybe should have happened between air traffic control and in the aircraft involved in terms of communication. Do you know, like as a pilot, do you get a view into what happens in these towers? Like, do you have to do like a rotation or something like that to see? And so
you don't know which crackhead is sliding whatever thing and telling you where.
You gotta go cracking.
Well, I'm just saying, somebody you got different people everywhere. There's people everywhere.
Yeah. As a matter of curiosity, it's not unusual for a pilot to organize going up on his own time, sit in the tower and just watch and listen. Mm-hmm. I've done some of that. Mm-hmm. So I have that, but there's no requirement. Yeah. I would imagine the vast majority of pilots have never been in an air traffic control tower.
Mm-hmm. And so I would imagine that job. I've never been in that job. I'd imagine it's very high stress. Obviously, I mean, you got lives, and I don't know how many flights a day there are in the U.S. I mean, tens of thousands. I don't know, but I mean, it's got to be a high stress environment. There's really zero room for error, and when there's any room for error, these kind of things happen. And so, unfortunately, fortunately, that happens. And so, when it comes down to when these investigations happen, and it'll all get flushed out, NTSB, FAA, all these other different organizations. And when they come out with that, do they decide like who was at fault, and then what happens in the industry in terms of lessons learned and going forward?
Yeah, so they will determine a cause, and we don't like to think of it in terms of whose fault was it. They will determine a cause, and they'll if the air traffic circumstance, like the fact that a full complement of controllers was not in the tower at the time. That will be a causal factor, if not a primary factor. The fact that the helicopter, we think, and again, we have two different sources of altitude information at this point. One says 200 feet, which is where they're supposed to be. Another one says 300 feet, which is obviously not where they're supposed to be, and that's where they ultimately ended up being. Why? And so what caused the helicopter to be someplace they were not supposed to be? And that they'll find a primary cause or a proximal cause, or they'll list the cause. The experience level of the pilots will be looked at. The experience level of the tower controllers will be looked at. How long had the tower controller been working that position? Were they new to the position? Now they say that the pilot who was being evaluated has between 450 and 500 hours, depending on who you talk to, on the airframe. And in that particular mission, they say that is an experienced pilot. Well, in pretty much any other world, 500 hours is not a lot of flying time. So that could be considered along that continuum or spectrum, if you will, of causes. And at some point, they'll shake it all out. They will name a main cause to do that.
I have the perfect segue here. Check this out. See, y'all think I'm just a chump. I got a perfect segue. Some of this question was a lead into, like, say, for example, not too long ago we had the 737 MAX 8 thing, and that whole shutdown and all those.
Yeah.
What is do you have a tie to the resolution of that software error in your flying career? Do you get where I'm going with that or no?
Do I have tie to the resolution?
When that was fixed?
Yeah, when it was fixed.
When it was fixed, where were you?
The MAX had been grounded for 2 years,
right?
And so worldwide, the worldwide equivalent of the FAA, each country has their own. They had to agree on a fix, software fix, a training fix. All pilots had to be trained on that thing. So, and to your point, Kurt, it was because there had been those two crashes. They had to place a cause of the crash, and they came up with fundamentally two. One was a software error inside the airplane. The other was training of the pilots. So both of those had to be addressed. And I don't know where we're going to go on the Black Hawk crash in DC, but me personally, I had to go sit through some classroom training, and then I had to go into the simulator and operate the new software in the updated I chose to become an author and a speaker. And in the process of, okay, what do I write about? I looked at, what can be helpful, and people around me had been through hard challenges, and how did they get out of those? How did they work through them? And so that book was about how people in my family and around me had faced challenges and worked their way through them, and there's stories in the book about that people can learn from.
And the second book?
Second book was a retrospective of Vietnam veterans, 10 Vietnam veterans. Kirk, you mean I didn't know this, that had been asked to create a memoir. And it was my honor to take their sticky notes out of shoe boxes and create a narrative of Vietnam veterans reflecting. Now, the book that you're referring to is the manuscript that the manuscript's done. I need to edit it, organize it a little bit better. It'll be based on my Captain's Log website, the Symphony of Your Life blog.com. All of those blog entries will become chapters in my book, and it's lessons that I learned in leadership and empathy and interacting with customers, customer service, those kinds of things as a leader in the customer service industry of aviation. And I hope to have that out fourth quarter this year. And it'll be something along the lines of the Captain's Log as the main title.
When are you going to do the stories of your journey as a pilot and a trainer? And I love all of some of my favorite books are like Viper Pilot, and a lot of those books about pilots and their stories and their history and all the crazy things they went through in their careers.
That there's some of that is in the Captain's Log.
Okay.
Some of the lessons. There's some Persian Gulf War stories in there. And I'm in the process of actually writing another one of my Persian Gulf stories. The scariest thing that ever happened to me as a pilot. And that may or may not make it into this book, but it'll make it into a book down the road.
Nice.
How many passengers have you flown in your career? Ballpark.
Somewhere in the order of 225,000 passengers.
Oh, so just a couple.
That's great.
Just one or two?
1.5 thousand, 1,500 or so flights as a captain. That's as a captain. Now, over my career, I have no idea.
As a captain.
But 225,000 people I have carried as a commander of an airplane.
That's amazing, man.
Yeah.
That's good stuff, man.
Well, I appreciate you coming in and letting everybody know that just because you look like a flying bus driver, it's really a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to it than that.
Hey, I want to tell you, man, I appreciate your service. Not only your military service, but your service as an airline pilot, airline captain. I thank you for being a difference maker. I thank you for being a good friend, good brother of mine, man. We had some great conversations and deep talks, all that kind of stuff, man. And so I want to thank you for just little iceberg tip conversation here. Obviously, we got to let people know how to get a hold of you or where people can find you if they want to know more or contact you or find your books. Or
He's
whatever.
available for hire, folks.
Yeah. So
He's got time.
I'm mostly retired now. I'm looking at my next act and what that's going to look like. And I anticipate that I'm still writing books. I anticipate that I will get back into training and speaking on some level at some time. And because of that, my actual personal direct cell phone is online. You can find me on all the socials. My personal website is symphonyofyourlife.com. It's not The Symphony. That's the blog post. The symphonyofyourlife.com. The symphonyofyourlifeblog.com is my blog site. Symphonyofyourlife.com is my website. You can see a lot about what I do, what I have done, what I will be doing in the future. And all the socials. LinkedIn particularly has my cell phone number. If you want to give me a call, feel free.
Well, thank you so much for coming and hanging out with us, Knuckleheads, and we appreciate you helping us unpack this.
An honor and a privilege, guys.
There's so much information. We're gonna have you back on for part 2, just because there's so much more we want to talk about. And we brought you in to kind of brought you in as clickbait, like we're gonna talk about this, and we talk about so many other things we barely even talked about that.
You're so deep, man. You
feel like they've been cheated.
No, there's so much more in there. I mean, people got it behind the scenes of what happens when you're sitting in you've gone through security, you're sitting in the airport all mad and sad or whatever else is going on with you. Things are going on, and they get to see a little behind the scenes of that, which is good.
Yeah.
Mark Hardcastle.
Yes, sir. And how'd you get a good call sign? Because I mean, most of our pilots, I can't even say some of those.
Right. Yeah. Well, a guy doesn't choose his own call sign.
That's right.
It's assigned by someone else. It was actually when I was in college. one of my roommates started that and it's stuck to me.
Oh, you got lucky. You got so lucky because some of the pilots in my squadron did not have hardcore like cold nights.
Check us out, Facebook, YouTube. Check us out, podcast. Unfortunately, while we're doing this, we had some internet issues. It looks like some of the stream kind of went up and down, but you can check us out, KLDC here in Denver, 12:20 a.m. And then, like I said, podcast, all those kind of platforms will have the actual unfiltered audio and all that kind of stuff, man. But your boys are here, Mad Men of Masculinity. We love each and every one of y'all.
Thank you again.
And until next time,
Mad Men Mafia, we are out.